In the summer of 1858, a young architect from England named Calvert Vaux sat at a drawing table in Manhattan and began designing bridges for a park that did not yet exist on ground that was mostly bare rock and swamp. He would draw about 36 of them in the end, and here is the strange rule he set himself: no two of those bridges would ever be alike. The man who hired the laborers and walked the ground beside him was Frederick Law Olmsted, failed farmer and writer, who had just been made superintendent of the project in September of 1857, and who would spend the next 15 years turning 843 acres of Manhattan schist, marsh, shanty into the most famous park on earth. I went looking for the truth about Central Park, the part the green lawns hide so well. What I found stopped me. The park is not natural, not 1 acre of it. It is one of the largest hand-built things Americans ever made, blasted out of 500-million-year-old bedrock, with more powder than was fired at the Battle of Gettysburg, and almost no one walking its paths today has any idea what is buried under their feet. So let me show you what it actually took to carve a wilderness by hand in the middle of a city, and why New York believed it had no choice. To understand why a growing city would spend a fortune to build a fake wilderness, you have to understand what Manhattan was becoming in the 1850s. The city was exploding upward and outward, packing more than 500,000 people onto the lower end of a narrow island. The streets were a grid of brick and noise and coal smoke. There was almost nowhere for an ordinary person to find grass, trees, or open sky. The wealthy could escape to the country. Everyone else lived in a stone city that grew denser every single year. New York looked across the ocean at London, with its great royal parks, and at Paris with its tree-lined promenades, and the leading men of the city felt something close to shame. A great metropolis, they argued, owed its people a place to breathe. Newspaper editors like William Cullen Bryant pushed the idea for years. The city needed a central park, a single enormous green space set aside before the grid swallowed every last open lot. By the early 1850s, the state had agreed, and the city began buying up land in the middle of the island, a long rectangle of ground that most respectable New Yorkers considered worthless. Was worthless by the standards of the time, which is exactly why it was available. The site chosen for Central Park was not a meadow waiting to be framed. It was some of the ugliest, hardest land on the island. Great ridges of gray Manhattan schist, the ancient bedrock of the city, pushed up out of the ground in jagged outcrops, far too rocky to farm and too broken to build on cheaply. Between the rock ridges lay low marshy hollows and stagnant swamps that bred mosquitoes. Through the summer, streams ran through it without order. Pig farmers, bone boilers, and people the city wanted out of sight had drifted up to the edges of this rough ground, because nobody with money wanted it. The land was not a blank green canvas. It was a problem that had to be conquered foot by foot, and the men who took on that problem understood, from the first survey, that almost everything a visitor would one day call natural was going to have to be invented, and then built by hand. The first man to truly measure that ground was an army-trained engineer named Egbert Ludovicus Viela. Beginning in 1856, walked the entire site and produced a topographical survey so detailed that engineers still study it. He mapped every rock outcrop, stream, every swamp and spring and boggy hollow across the whole rectangle. His survey is a portrait of chaos, a tangle of wet ground and stone that looks nothing like the smooth park we know. Also drew up the first practical plan for draining the marshes, because no park could exist on top of standing water and disease. He became the engineer-in-chief of the works, and it was under his early authority that the real labor began. Viela's own design for the park was a plain and unimaginative thing, and the commissioners who ran the project were not satisfied. In 1857, they did something unusual. They threw the design open to a public competition, and they invited anyone in the country to submit a plan for what this park should become. That competition is where the two names at the heart of this story come together. Frederick Law Olmsted had already been hired as the superintendent in charge of the men clearing the ground, a job he took partly because his writing and farming ventures had failed, and he badly needed the work. Calvert Vaux was an English architect, trained in London, who had come to America and built a reputation designing country houses along the Hudson. Vaux believed Viela's plan was hopeless, and he believed he could do better, but he needed a partner who understood the land and the labor. He asked Olmsted to join him. Through the fall and winter of 1857, and into the spring of 1858, the two men worked nights and weekends, walking the rocky ground by day and drawing by lamplight, racing a deadline. They delivered their entry late in the evening of the 31st of March, 1858, only minutes before the cutoff, and they called it the Greensward Plan. On the 28th of April, The commissioners chose it over 32 rival designs and awarded the two partners the grand prize of $2,000. The park, as we know it, was born on paper that spring, and the digging that would make it real was about to begin in earnest. The Greensward Plan was a quiet act of genius, and one single idea in it is the reason it won. The commissioners had set a difficult condition that broke most of the 33 plans submitted. The park had to allow city traffic to cross from the east side to the west side. No city would let a rectangle this large simply block all crosstown movement for years to come. Most designers solved that by running ordinary roads straight across the park would have sliced the green space into pieces and filled it with the noise of commercial carts. Olmsted and Vaux did something nobody else thought of. They proposed to sink 4 crosstown roads down into deep trenches below the level of the park, screened by stone walls and planting and bridged over by the walking paths, so that traffic could rumble through unseen while a person on the lawns above would never know it was there. Those 4 sunken transverse roads, what are now 65th, 79th, 85th, and 97th Streets, were the masterstroke that beat every rival, and they are still down there today, carrying traffic in their cuttings while joggers crossed the bridges above without a glance. It was the first time anyone had separated different kinds of movement onto different levels like that, an idea so far ahead of its time that highway engineers would borrow it a century later. The sunken roads were only the first move in a much larger sleight of hand, because the central idea of the whole plan was deception. Olmsted and Vaux did not want the park to look designed. They wanted a visitor to walk into it and feel they had stepped out of the city and into a piece of real countryside with rolling meadows, dark wooded glens, still water and rocky outcrops, all of it appearing wild and natural and old. To pull off that illusion on this broken ground, almost nothing could be left as it was. The swamps had to be drained and rebuilt as lakes. The low ground had to be raised. The bare rock had to be either blasted away or shaped into picturesque outcrops. Hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs had to be planted to make forests that had never grown there. The roads carrying carriages and the paths carrying walkers and the bridle trails carrying riders all had to be threaded through the park without ever crossing each other at the same level, so that the noise and danger of traffic would never break the spell. Every single one of those demands meant the same thing on the ground. It meant men with picks and shovels and gunpowder moving the earth of Manhattan by muscle for years. If the idea of moving an entire landscape by hand is the kind of history you came here for, I want to point you to something. The story that taught American engineers how to move water and earth on this scale was the Erie Canal, a great ditch dug across New York State, with nothing but shovels, wheelbarrows, and black powder, decades before any of this. The full illustrated account of how that canal was built by hand is now a book, and you can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. Before a single lake could be dug, though the people already living on that land had to go, and this is the part of the story the lawns cover most completely. The most established community on the park site was a settlement on the western edge that had a name. It was called Seneca Village. It had begun in 1825. A free black man named Andrew Williams bought 3 lots of ground, and on the very same day, a trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church named Epiphany Davis bought 12 more. Around those first purchases, a real village grew up over the next 30 years. By the 1850s, Seneca Village held something like 225 people, mostly free black families, later joined by Irish and German immigrants. It had wooden homes, vegetable gardens, 3 churches, at least 2 schools, and its own cemeteries. For many of the black families who lived there, owning that land meant something the rest of the city denied them, because in New York at the time, a black man needed to own a certain amount of property before he was allowed to vote. Seneca Village was not a squatter camp. It was a settled landowning community with deeds and churches and a generation of roots. In 1857, the city took it. Under the legal power of eminent domain, authority of a government to seize private property for public use. The city condemned all the land inside the park boundary and ordered everyone off it. Across the whole site, roughly 1,600 people were displaced, and the residents of Seneca Village were among them. The owners were paid for their land, though many said bitterly that the prices were far below what the property was worth. Their appeals were brushed aside. The homes were pulled down, the churches emptied, the gardens torn up. By 1857, the village that had stood for more than 30 years was simply gone, scraped off the map to make room for the meadows. For well over a century, almost no trace of it survived in public memory, and visitors strolled across the western lawns with no idea that a whole community had once lived, worshipped, buried its dead on that exact ground. The grass remembers nothing, the record does. And so we say their names where we can. Andrew Williams and Epiphany Davis, the men who bought the first lots because the park was built on the place they lost. With the land cleared, the war against the bedrock could begin. And bedrock is the right word, because the rock under Central Park is among the oldest and hardest material in the city. It is called Manhattan schist, a tough, glittering gray stone formed deep in the earth around 500 million years ago, long before there were trees or bones or anything alive to see it. Across the park site, the schist did not lie quietly underground. It heaved up into great ridges and knobs and cliffs, blocking the paths the designers wanted to run, rising where the meadows were supposed to be smooth. There was no machine in 1858 that could chew through stone like that. The only way through was the way men had broken rock for centuries. A worker would take a hand drill and a hammer, set the drill point against the stone, and strike it, turning the bit a fraction after every blow, driving a narrow hole down into the rock an inch at a time. It could take hours to sink a single hole deep enough. The hole was packed with black powder, a fuse was set, the men took cover, and the charge blew the stone apart. Then they did it again, and again across acres of ground. The scale of that blasting is almost hard to believe, and it gives you the single most striking number in the whole story. To break the rock that stood in the way of the park, workers burned through something on the order of 166 tons of gunpowder. Sit with that figure for a moment. That is more black powder than both armies fired at the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. New York did not spend that much explosive to win a war. It spent it to build a place for families to walk on a Sunday afternoon. Day after day, for years, the ridges of Lower Manhattan shook with blasting as crews tore the bedrock down to the grade the designers wanted, hauled the shattered stone away in carts, and slowly forced the wild rock of the island to lie down. Some of the most beautiful outcrops you can still climb in the park today were deliberately spared and shaped, left standing as picturesque crags. Everything around them was blown flat by hand. Breaking the rock was only half the earthwork. The other half was moving dirt, and the quantity of it defies the imagination. To turn swamp and stone into rolling meadow and shaded wood, the builders did not just remove material. They hauled in staggering amounts of new soil, because the thin, sour ground left after the blasting could not grow the forests Olmsted wanted. Carts and wagons brought in topsoil from outside the park, much of it dragged across from New Jersey and up from other parts of the island, load after load after load. When the counting was finally done, the workers had moved close to 3 million cubic yards of stone and soil across the park site. 3 million. Picture an endless line of horse carts, each one holding maybe a single cubic yard, rolling in and out from dawn to dusk for years, and you begin to feel the weight of it. The low swampy hollows were filled and raised. The future meadows were graded smooth and blanketed in fresh earth. The whole surface of the park, every gentle rise and dip that feels so natural under your feet, was sculpted by men with shovels and carts moving the ground of the city by hand. And under all of it, hidden, ran the part of the park almost nobody ever thinks about. The land had been a swamp. Water does not simply stop being a problem because you order it to. So before the meadows could ever stay dry, the builders laid down a vast hidden network of drainage beneath the surface. They dug trenches across the wet ground and laid lengths of baked clay pipe, tile drains along the bottom, then buried them. These buried pipes gathered groundwater that had once pooled into marshes and carried it quietly away to the new lakes and out of the park. Miles upon miles of clay tile went into the ground, an entire invisible plumbing system feeding the visible one above. The same crews built silt basins and stone-lined channels to manage every drop of rain. The result is one of the quiet miracles of the place. Park built on a swamp that almost never floods, because under the grass an army of laborers laid a skeleton of clay pipe by hand. Most of it is still down there, still working, more than a century and a half later. Now hold all that earthwork in your mind, blasting and the carting and the buried pipe, and look at the hands that did it, because this is where the real weight of the park lives. The work was done by thousands of laborers, and most of them were immigrants, Irish and German men who had crossed the ocean into a city that needed their backs and gave them very little in return. By the spring of 1858, more than 3,000 men were already at work on the ground, dredging, blasting, grading, and planting, and over the long years of construction, something like 20,000 workers passed across the project in all. The common laborer, swinging the pick and pushing the barrow, was often paid only about $1 a day. The skilled men earned more, the stonecutters and the masons, climbing to a little over $2 a day as the work went on, but the bulk of the muscle came cheap. These were men who lived in crowded tenements downtown or in rough shanties near the work, who labored through the heat of summer and the cold of a New York winter, breaking rock and hauling earth so that wealthier New Yorkers could one day stroll the lawns in carriages. For most of them, the ledger gives no name, only a number. They were hired, counted, and replaced. The park is their monument, and almost none of them are remembered by name. There were craftsmen among them, too, and their fingerprints are the most beautiful thing in the entire park. Olmsted and Vaux had decided that wherever a carriage road, a walking path, and a bridle trail had to cross, they would never meet on the level. Instead, the paths would dive under and over one another, separated by bridges and arches, so that a person on foot could wander for hours and never once have to stop for a passing carriage. That single design decision created the need for the bridges, and Calvert Vaux took that need and turned it into art. The Greensward Plan called for some 36 bridges and arches, and Vaux, working closely with a gifted designer named Jacob Ray Mould, drew nearly every one of them with this iron rule: no two would be the same. Some he built of rough Manhattan schist and granite, heavy rustic spans that look as though the rock heaved itself into an arch. Others he cast in delicate lacy iron, painted and ornamented like jewelry. Some were brick, some were pale marble, some were carved sandstone covered in birds and leaves and vines. Each bridge was designed for its exact spot, framing the view beyond it like a picture. Of the roughly 39 spans the park held at its height, the great majority were unique creations of Vaux and Mould, and walking among them is like flipping through a catalog of every way the 19th century knew how to span a gap in stone and iron. If you want the purest example of the rough stone style, the one that fools people most completely, walk up to the north end of the park and find Huddlestone Arch. It carries a heavy carriage road over the wooded ravine. It is built entirely out of enormous raw boulders pulled from the surrounding ground, one of them said to weigh more than 100 tons. Here is the astonishing part. Those boulders are held together by nothing. There is no mortar, no cement, no iron, no hidden support of any kind. The stones are simply fitted and stacked, so that their own weight locks them together, huddling against one another under the pressure of the load, exactly as a true stone arch is meant to. Olmsted and Vaux built it that way on purpose, so that a visitor, coming upon it in the trees, would feel they had stumbled onto something nature itself had thrown up. A little frightening and very old, when in truth it had been assembled by hand from loose rock. A heavy road has rolled over those balanced boulders for more than a century and a half, and they have never shifted. The most beloved of all of them shows you exactly what that craftsmanship could do. Bow Bridge, long, graceful cast iron span that arcs across the lake, was designed by Calvert Vaux and built between 1859 and 1862. It is so slender and so perfectly curved that it looks less like a piece of engineering and more like a drawn line laid down on the water, and it has become one of the most photographed bridges in the world. Not far from it stands Bethesda Terrace, the grand stone heart of the park, begun in 1859 and finished around 1863 after years of carving straight through the Civil War. Every leaf, every bird, every cluster of fruit on the sandstone of that terrace was cut by hand by stone carvers working from Vaux and Mould's designs. It is the only place in the original plan where the builders allowed themselves to be openly grand, a formal stone stage looking out over the lake, and it was shaped block by craftsmen whose names, like the laborers, mostly went unrecorded. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the quiet engineering and the unnamed hands behind the things we walk past every day, take a second to subscribe or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. The simplest way to keep work like this going. There was one piece of the puzzle the designers could not move, and they had to build the entire park around it. Sitting in the middle of the rectangle was a giant rectangular reservoir, full of water from the Croton system, the great aqueduct that had begun carrying clean water down to the city by gravity in 1842. An older receiving reservoir from that same Croton project already occupied a 31-acre block of the park ground, and while the park was being built, the city added a second larger reservoir alongside it, completing that one around 1862. These were not decorative ponds. They were working public waterworks, hard-edged basins of stored drinking water that the park was legally bound to leave in place. So Olmsted and Vaux simply wrapped their wild landscape around the machinery. They softened the reservoir's edges with planting and ran a path around it. And to this day, a runner circling the water in the upper park is jogging around a piece of 19th century plumbing dressed up as scenery. The park and the city's water supply were braided together from the very beginning, two enormous hand-built public works sharing the same ground. While the deep earthwork ground on, the park slowly began to open and breathe. And New Yorkers got their first taste of what was being made. Worked from the bottom of the rectangle upward, finishing the southern end first, and the public could not wait for the rest. In the winter of 1859, with much of the park still raw and unfinished, the city allowed people onto the brand new lake, the body of water that had been carved out of a former swamp, and let them skate. The response was astonishing. Thousands upon thousands of New Yorkers poured up to the unfinished park to glide across the ice on a lake that had been a stinking marsh only a year, two before. For people who had never had open space in their lives, it was a kind of revelation, proof that the strange muddy construction site uptown was going to become something wonderful. Year by year, as the crews moved north, more of the park opened, the meadows greened, the young trees took hold, and the carriage drives filled on Sunday afternoons. The illusion was beginning to work. The thing that had been blasted and carted and drained into existence was starting at last to look as though it had always been there. Hold on to that word, illusion, because it is the secret of the entire place, and it is the thing Olmsted cared about most. Every choice in the park was made to hide the labor that built it. The transverse roads that let crosstown traffic pass through the park were sunk down into deep cuts below the level of the lawns, screened by trees and bridged over, so that a person walking the meadows would never see a single cart of commercial traffic rumbling through. The forests were designed in layers, with the right trees and shrubs planted to look like a woodland that had grown wild over a century, when in truth not one of them predated the construction. The streams and ponds were shaped to look like the careless work of nature. Every curve had been dug and lined by men. The picturesque rock outcrops were chosen and trimmed for effect. The genius of Central Park is that it does not look like an achievement at all. It looks like luck, like a scrap of countryside the city happened to spare, and that is precisely the trick. The harder the men worked, the more invisible their work was meant to become. A bridge is a thing you notice. A meadow that feels like it was always there is the highest art there is, and it is also a lie, the most beautiful lie ever told in stone and soil. By 1873, after roughly 15 years of digging and blasting and planting, the main work was largely done, and the scale of what the hands had accomplished was almost too large to take in. They had taken 843 acres of swamp and bedrock and shanty, condemned and cleared a whole community off it, blasted away ridges of 500-million-year-old stone with more powder than was fired at Gettysburg, close to 3 million cubic yards of earth, buried miles of clay drainage pipe, raised some 36 bridges of which no two were alike, and planted hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs to grow a forest that had never existed. They had done nearly all of it with picks, shovels, hand drills, black powder, horse carts, and the strength of their own backs in an age before the gasoline engine, before the bulldozer, before the steam shovel was anything more than an experiment. And they had hidden every bit of that effort under a surface so convincingly natural. For generations afterward, ordinary people would assume the park had simply always been green. Influence of what they built ran far past the borders of New York. Central Park was the first great landscaped public park in the United States, and its success changed the country. Frederick Law Olmsted went on from it to become the father of American landscape architecture, the man more responsible than any other for the idea that a city owes its people green space. He and Vaux designed Prospect Park across the river in Brooklyn, and Olmsted's hand later shaped parks and park systems in city after city, from Boston to Buffalo to Chicago, and beyond, along with college campuses and the grounds of the United States Capitol. The blueprint was always the same one proven in Manhattan, a designed wilderness in the middle of a crowded city, to look effortless and ageless, even though every inch of it had been engineered. The model spread across the nation. Cities that watched New York carve a park out of bare rock decided they wanted one too, and the public park, free and open to all, became a basic feature of the American city. It started here on this broken ground with these unnamed hands. I keep coming back to the contradiction at the center of it, the thing that makes Central Park different from almost anything else humans have built. We usually celebrate great works by making the labor visible. A cathedral wants you to gasp. A bridge wants you to marvel at its span. A skyscraper exists to be seen. Central Park is the opposite. It was one of the most enormous and difficult construction projects of the 19th century, and its entire purpose was to erase every sign that it had ever been built. The 20,000 workers, 166 tons of powder, the 3 million cubic yards of earth, the buried pipe, the blasted ridges, all of it vanishes the moment you step onto the grass and feel like you have wandered into the countryside by accident. the men who made it succeeded so completely that they made themselves disappear. There is something almost unbearably moving in that, in pouring 15 years of the hardest hand labor into a place whose highest achievement is that nobody can tell it was made at all. So the next time you see Central Park, in a photograph, in a film, or under your own feet, I want you to try to see through it. See past the green to the gray schist that filled this ground, to the swamp that bred fever here, to the village that stood on the western edge until the city tore it down, to the Irish and German laborers swinging picks for $1 a day, to Calvert Vaux drawing his 36 bridges so that no two would ever be the same, to the carts of New Jersey, topsoil rolling in by the 100,000 load. None of it was natural. All of it was built by hand in plain sight, and then hidden under a lawn so convincing that we forgot. Which leaves me with a harder question, and I am going to hand it to you. We tend to think the truly great works of a civilization are the ones it puts on display, the monuments and towers and domes it builds to be admired forever. But the people who made Central Park spent 15 years and a fortune in muscle, something whose greatest success was that it looked like it had never been built. They blasted bedrock and moved mountains of earth so that a tired clerk and his family could lie on the grass and believe for one afternoon the city had simply paused and let a piece of wilderness through. So here is what I keep wondering, and I would genuinely like your answer. Is the higher achievement the monument that shouts its own greatness, or the one that hides all its labor so the people who use it never feel the weight of what it cost? I have my own answer, and I am not sure it is the obvious one. Tell me yours down in the comments. I do not think this is anywhere near as simple as it sounds. And if you want the deeper origin of all of this, the Erie Canal that first taught Americans how to move earth and water across a whole state by hand, decades before they ever blasted a park out of Manhattan rock, the full illustrated story is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up. And thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you at the next one.